the nuts and bolts of responsive neurostimulation. I'll try to explain why we think closed-loop approaches toward controlling brain activity is a good idea. Then I'll show you a little bit of what the actual systems look like and try and explain that. And then go through as best I can without getting too lengthy the typical procedures that we do decide whether a patient or advise a patient as to whether or not they're a good candidate for a responsive neurostimulator, and then the steps that we take for working things up, making sure we're safe, actually implanting the device, and then using the device. So I'll try and go through all of that and give you as much information as I can. Finally, I'll spend some time going through the data from the clinical trials that were performed that give us confidence that this is a worthwhile approach. A couple minutes for summary, and then we'll get back to Alita telling her story a little bit so that you get the perspective from somebody who's really gone through this, the people who matter. And finally, we'll leave as much time as we can at the end so that we can answer any of your questions that have remained. So getting into it now, why do we use a closed loop system and what is a closed loop system? So really it's pretty straightforward. What a closed loop brain responsive system does that all the other currently available systems don't do is it has this loop of activity where the system, the device, is monitoring brain activity, and in this case it does so continuously. And then it's looking to see if there's a particular pattern of activity. When it detects that pattern, it can then stimulate. And with the idea that that stimulation, which in this case is an electrical stimulation, will curtail the seizure activity. And the system is always doing this. It's always on. It's always looking for that brain activity, making a decision, and then acting upon it. It is, on an occasional basis, also recording that activity. So it takes a little snippet of data and puts it in memory for us to look at later on. So you have this loop as well as this sort of branch off the loop of actually recording data. And that's really a unique system because this is therefore responding to the brain and what the brain is doing as opposed to just doing something sort of constantly or at some sort of fixed time point, which is how other systems, for example, the vagal nerve stimulator, the VNS, that's an always-on system or a sporadic system. It's on a set schedule, so it stimulates on a set schedule. This system doesn't do that. It's looking for activity and then responds to that activity. So the possible advantages, or the way we think of the advantages of this approach versus other approaches, is that for one thing, it should be responding only to pathological events. That is, it should only be responding to abnormal events. If this is ideally happening, it's really happening in a way that's different than both other devices and medications. Medications you take all the time, the medication is in your blood all the time, it's interacting with different aspects of the nervous system all the time. This system, if everything is working properly, should only be responding when there's an actual seizure. As a result, some possible advantages are that you shouldn't get this phenomenon of habituation. That is, stimulation with the same settings should give you the same response. You shouldn't lose the effectiveness of the stimulation over time, because it's only doing it when there are these pathological events. I'll return to that point a little bit later on, however. In addition, because you're only stimulating during these funny events, these seizures, you should get less side effects, even if there are side effects, because you're not doing it all the time. And that's true particularly for cognitive side effects. Cognitive side effects should be much less if you're only stimulating during the seizure itself. And then from a sort of engineering perspective, by stimulating only when there are seizures and not at all other times, you're hopefully pushing your battery life longer and longer, which means you don't have to switch out the device or make any changes to it except over longer periods of time, and that's obviously an advantage as well. Now, the other thing that's a little bit different about this system, or a feature of this system, is that the setup, and I'll explain the setup in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes, is that the electrodes themselves are actually in or on the brain. And that has the advantage of getting us right to the business end of things, really recording directly from the areas that we think are giving rise to seizures. That allows us to get a very clean signal, what's in the engineering world called an excellent signal-to-noise ratio. In addition, because the electrodes are inside the skull, the likelihood of them moving around or going places they're not supposed to go or breaking is very low. And perhaps most importantly, the patient doesn't see or feel the device. It's very low profile. After the surgery and after things are closed up and the hair grows back, it's all invisible. It's, in fact, even if you run your hand across the area where the device is, it's very hard to detect that it's there. So cosmetically, it's quite reasonable, and Alita can say more about that later on because she actually has one. Let me, I'm going to jump for a second here. Let me just point out something. I don't know whether my pointer shows up here or not, but in this little diagram here, you see that there are a couple different components. There's this silver sort of rectangular thing, which is the actual electronics that do the business end of thinking about or looking at what the electrical recording are. And then there's just two examples of two different kinds of electrodes that we use. One is sort of this paddle-shaped electrode, and another is a depth electrode that goes deep. I'll show some more pictures of these in just a minute, I believe, but that's the basic setup of the system. So how do we choose who's a good candidate for this system, which is also called the RNS system, the responsive neurostimulator system? So the indications from the FDA point of view is that the patient must be an adult. They must be 18 years or older. They should have failed at least 2 seizure medications, and by failed, we usually mean in our practice that we're not getting a good enough control over the seizures with the 2 medications. And ideally, they have what are called partial onset seizures, or sometimes you'll hear this phrase focal seizures or localization-related seizures. These all mean essentially the same thing. But essentially the idea is that the seizures are emanating from a region in the brain that we could localize and sort of give a name to. And ideally, there should be 1 or 2 foci. Now, I'll say that these are the sort of the rules that come out of the FDA. We don't have to, or nor do we actually follow them clinically. So patients who have foci that are a little bit hard to determine exactly where they're coming from, or perhaps they have more than 2 foci, they still may be candidates for having this system implanted. And that's a discussion that we as the physicians and the rest of the care team would have with the patient and the family to talk about the risks and benefits under any of these circumstances to see what fits. Some other considerations that come into play when we're making these recommendations are, what are the risks of proceeding with a more standard surgical resection where we remove parts of the cortex or the brain? You know, is there high risk for neurological deficits or cognitive deficits? So a classic example would be a seizure that's coming from the motor area. That's an area where we certainly would not recommend a resection, because then we could leave somebody with weakness on one side. That might be a situation where we think heavily about using one of these RNS systems. Sometimes, and quite often, it's patient choice. There are patients who are more comfortable with the risks of a surgical approach, and other ones who are not, and that will factor largely in our decision together to proceed toward a RNS system. What we have found is that early on, the effect seems to be pretty equal across lots of patients, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But the type of epilepsy or where it's coming from, the fact that they've been on other medications or they've had a VNS doesn't necessarily either force us or preclude us from proceeding with an RNS. It's, again, something that's part of an iterative decision-making process. So here's another view of it. I just wanted to show this little picture on the side here, the actual device. So it's a little metal can. It's a titanium can, and inside this can is all the electronics that do the business, like I mentioned before. There are two leads that come out, and they could end in either these little panels, which have 4 electrodes on it, so a little paddle-shaped one here, or it could end in this other type that's designed to go into the parenchyma of the brain, into the actual brain substance, to try and get toward deep structures like the hippocampus. And this also has 4 contacts on it as well. And you can mix and match. You could use 2 paddles, you could use 2 depths, one of each as shown here. That depends on exactly what area you're trying to get to and what you're trying to sample. And again, that's a decision that you'll talk about with the various physicians that are involved in your care. Here's sort of a quick view of the procedure. Once we've sort of figured out that a patient is a good candidate and we've done some previous investigations, so we have to know where do we want to place these electrodes. Now, sometimes that's done with information like a scalp EEG data as well as MRI structural data. Maybe we'll also have data from functional MRI or from a magnetoencephalography scan, a MEG scan. That might be sufficient. Sometimes, however, that's not sufficient and we're still not sure of where a patient's seizures are coming from or where areas of cortex like language area or motor area is. And in that case, we might recommend that the patient have an investigation where electrodes are put underneath the skull so we could get even better detailed EEG data from where the seizures start from. You'll hear that sometimes called a grid and strip investigation, which is where the electrodes are placed on the sort of outside of the brain. So they're placed in this space here. Again, if you can see my cursor, just on the surface of the brain. Or maybe we'll do what's called depth investigation, also stereotactic EEG or SEEG. There's lots of different names for these procedures. And that lets us get electrodes into deeper structures like the hippocampus, which is what's targeted here on this right-hand side picture in the yellow dot. That's aiming toward the hippocampus. For some patients, we will recommend that they undergo that procedure before we even decide whether a neurostimulator is appropriate or not. If it is appropriate, where it goes. And again, other patients, that might not be necessary. We might get enough information based on all sorts of other ancillary tests. But once we've clearly determined where we want to put the device and that the device should go in and where we should put it, and everybody's on board, then the electrodes are put at the seizure focus as best we can determine it. We will sometimes implant 4 separate leads. And I just want to go back for 1 second and again make it clear that each of these wires is called a lead. So we might put 4 of those in, but we're only going to connect 2 of them at a time to the device. The device itself, this box, again going back, this little box here, sits actually in the skull. So what we do is we cut out, we as the neurosurgeon, we cut out a piece of the skull that fits that device exactly. We put in a little titanium can, you can sort of think of it as a little well that replaces the skull. Titanium is very hard and very stiff and does a good job acting as skull to protect the brain. And the electronics box that I showed you slips into that little well, and it conforms to the skull, so it's really nice and smooth with the skull surface. The scalp gets closed up above that and will heal up above that, and you won't see anything or really be able to feel anything. And this whole set of procedures is not it's not magic. It's actually very standard in the neurosurgical world for doing exactly what I described for all sorts of different things and with all sorts of different devices. So it's not like there's a totally new set of approaches being used for this. It's fairly standard that a good neurosurgeon who does epilepsy-related surgery will have no problem doing this kind of work. Afterwards, the key is that we're now able to get information out of the device, and that's done using what's called the patient monitor and wand. The patient monitor is a fancy name for a laptop computer. The wand is this black thing you see that this figure is holding up here. The wand is basically a radio frequency transmitter and receiver, and it's able to collect data from the device through the skin. And that allows us to get data out of the recording, bring it into the laptop, and then from the laptop we transmit it through the internet to a big set of computers that NeuroPace maintains, but that the physicians have access to, so we could see the data. The whole process of downloading that data usually takes a few minutes on average. And then we're able to log in. You can see on the right-hand side here, the physician's able to log into this system called the Patient Data Management System, and we can look at the data that came down, including the actual recordings of seizures like you see on this right-hand panel in small view. These are little examples of seizures. That gives us, incredible information over long periods of time about how often do the seizures appear to be occurring, what do they look like, are the settings of the device right, do we need to tweak them? We get all sorts of information out of that. And then we can tailor exactly what we're doing. So we could first look at a bunch of recordings and look at the patterns that we see on those recordings, and then adjust the settings on the little device to detect just those patterns and use that to figure out when a seizure is occurring. And we do that for each patient, and we do that as they are bringing us data over time. We make refinements into exactly how that detection system works. Once we've got a detection setting that we think is doing a good job finding the seizures, we can then switch on the device to actually stimulate. So now once those patterns are detected, the stimulation will occur automatically. And again, over time, based on how the patient is doing and what we're seeing in these recordings, we can make further adjustments to either the detector or the stimulator to try and eventually arrive at a set of detectors and stimulators that are actually controlling the seizures as best as possible. And so here's just an example on this next slide, slide 12 here, where we have an example of the recording. This is a blow up from the other page or something like it. You can see over here in the middle where there's a red box and it says A1. That's the beginning of a seizure, and this is a seizure coming from the hippocampus. So we can adjust our detector to look for that kind of beginning for this patient. Here's another, down on the bottom here is an example from a different patient with a very different onset, now coming from the right hippocampus. It's a different kind of seizure. We could set up a detector just to look for that kind of seizure and respond to that kind of seizure. And so it's only stimulating during those events. Right, and that gets back to this whole idea of closed loop and tailored detection. We can set it up so it's only looking for that kind of pattern and stimulate during that event and control things that way. All right, so there's lots of different parameters that we can adjust. And I think this is sometimes a point of both confusion and frustration for our patients. We've got 8 different electrodes. We've got a bunch of different ways that we can stimulate through those electrodes. I'm showing you a couple of the parameter settings here in terms of the amplitude or the strength of the stimulation, how long it goes, how high frequency it is. So there's a lot of little pulses given, and we can control the frequency of that, and we can control how long that goes for. And so this gives us a lot of flexibility, but it also means there's a lot of things that we could try out to try and find the absolute best settings. And that takes some time, and it's different than a medication where we either go up on the dose or we go down on the dose. Here we can go up and sideways in all sorts of different directions on these parameters, and that might take us some doing to get exactly right for a given patient. Some side effects we'll talk about. The side effects are really pretty minimal. In this slide, I'm showing an example comparing what's known about VNS therapy, the vagal nerve stimulator, compared to the RNS system. And you can see that the average stimulation is much less for the RNS than it is for the VNS. And that there's also many sort of smaller percentage of patients have side effects, and they tend to be short-lived and single side effects. And one of the things that we could do with this device is when you're visiting us in the clinic, we could test out a stimulation set, see what kind of responses or problems there are. If there are problems, we'll know about them right away, and we could change the parameters right then and there and avoid them. So that's one of the ways that we're actually able to avoid significant side effects for the vast majority of our patients. So what's the typical sequence of events? As I described, there's all that workup that has to be done beforehand for us to get the best handle on where the seizure is coming from and where are important areas of the brain, Is this the right technique? Is this the right approach? A lot of factoring in there, a lot of discussion. At Mass General, we do this like most places do with a fairly big team approach, where there's somewhere on the order of 10 or so epilepsy doctors, a neurosurgeon, a neuropsychologist, some nurses, a psychiatrist, all involved in a team discussion as to what do we think is the right way to go and what could we recommend. And then, of course, multiple conversations with the patient themselves. Once all that's done and we go ahead and we go through the surgery and we get the device implanted, there's sort of 3 phases. There's an immediate post-implant phase, which is the couple of days in the hospital. During that period, we teach the patient and their family how to use the remote monitor. It's pretty easy. It takes about 10 minutes for me to show it. We turn on default detection settings, and then we get the patient out of the hospital and get them home. Typically, in our hands, that takes 1 to 2 days for the most part. We then want the patient back to see us in about 2 weeks. Usually some of that's to follow up on surgical issues, but also we start to look at the data. During that time, we ask the patient to try and collect data from the device daily, so once a day, usually in the evening. We say spend 5 minutes getting the data to your computer, and then try and plug in the computer and send the data to our servers, and then we'll look at it. And then when you come in 2 weeks, we would have reviewed that data, and we say, is the detection system working well or not? Do we need to change some settings on it? And then after that, we'll spread out the visits depending on how often the seizures are occurring, how good is the data, how good is our detection settings. If things are going well, we hopefully would have collected a few seizures, shown that our detector is working well, and then we'll actually turn on the stimulator. And that might occur a month after the surgery or maybe a couple months after. Again, depends very much on how often the seizures are occurring. And then after that, we'll probably, for about the first year, be meeting every 3 months or so to check in and make further adjustments if it's necessary to try and get toward seizure freedom. So what is the information that we're going to actually get towards seizure freedom? There were a series of clinical trials that occurred, and there's still one that's ongoing. There was first a feasibility trial involving 65 patients, just to show that this thing worked, essentially. There was then a pivotal trial to show that it was effective. There was 191 patients, and I should point out that we being MGH, was part of that pivotal trial. And there was then an open label period where after people who had been in the study, they could be followed for another 7 years. And now there's a new post-approval study which is designed to enroll patients who are getting the device under, not in the trial, but under normal clinical circumstances, also be followed so we can get an even better handle on long-term effectiveness and safety issues. Of the patients in the trial, there were 256 of them. I won't go through all of these details. I just want to point out that there were patients who had seizures coming from one side or both sides if they had temporal lobe epilepsy. There were patients with temporal lobe epilepsy, frontal lobe epilepsy, even epilepsy from the parietal and occipital lobe. All sorts of different etiologies were involved, so there was a pretty wide range of different patients and patient types, some who had a vagal nerve stimulator, some who had undergone epilepsy surgery previously. Around, a bit over half of them had undergone some sort of intracranial monitoring, so either the grids and strips or the depths that I talked about prior to actually being enrolled in the study. And this is what the improvements looks like. So these are the percent reduction in seizures. So by 4 years or so out from the implantation, 63% of, there was approximately on average a 63% reduction in seizures. You can see over on the right that 37% of the patients ended up with having 3 months seizure-free, around a quarter of the patients had 6 months seizure-free, and about 13% of the patients had more than a year seizure-free. So some patients get to the level of being able to have no seizures. Many do not, but they have a substantial reduction in their number of seizures, and that could be beneficial in and of itself. Other patients will get a reduction and also be in a position where we can reduce their medications, and that also might be a goal that patients are looking for also. Now, one of the things I just want to, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. One of the things I want to point out is, sort of as an aside, the original intent of this closed-loop device was to be able to sense the seizure and stop it. And if that worked perfectly, then there would be no more seizures. I think that what the data is showing in my experience and what I've read in the literature from other folks is that there also might be an effect of this device that's not just stopping the ongoing seizure when it happens, but is leading to modifications in the actual networks of the brain such that there's even less likelihood of there being seizures. And this is a really interesting development from the point of view of understanding what's happening, but it also has some really interesting therapeutic implications because it might mean that as we go out longer and longer and get more and more experience in using these devices, we might be able to really move closer and closer toward curing or at least stopping, all seizures because we might be modifying the underlying epileptic substrate. That's I think an exciting and promising development that we're looking forward to expanding upon as time goes on. Safety has been really quite good for this device. The rate of serious events, it's similar to that of the deep brain stimulator that's used for movement disorders, for example, used for Parkinson's disease. There's some infection risk. All the reported infections were soft tissue, that is, that weren't in the brain, and they didn't have any real chronic problems. They just were dealt with antibiotics or a redo of the surgery or something like that. There were a very small number of hemorrhages as a result of the implant, and again, none of them led to persistent, really clinically significant neurological problems. So, based on these, we think of this as a really quite safe approach without a lot of significant side effects, and no major sequelae are likely to arise because of it. Right? But I think it's important to keep this last point in mind, which is that we're really at the beginning of learning how to use this concept of responsive neurostimulation. We've got some promising results, and as a result, our group is recommending this to patients, but we also recognize that over time, we're probably going to get better at this. We're going to learn more about how we should be stimulating. We're also going to learn more about how we can use the data that we get to understand better what's happening in a given patient with their seizures, as well as what's happening for seizures in general. We might be able to use this same system to not only stimulate, but to begin thinking of ways that we could alter anti-epileptic medication and adjust things better there. We might be able to find, and we've been finding, longer-term cycles that even patients aren't fully aware of, and that might allow us to play with the medications in a different way or come up with behavioral management approaches. So there's a lot of things that this system is allowing us to do that goes beyond the simple sort of closed-loop stimulation approach. And I think it's a really exciting therapy option that is good for some patients right now and will continue to improve in many ways. And I think we'll be seeing more and more patients turning to this to try and control their seizures as best as possible. And with that sort of detailed stuff done, the most important part here is to listen to Ida and her story of going through this process.
Thanks, Dr. Cash. I'll keep this brief because there's probably more questions out there that I don't know about. So the big drum roll is how good has it been for me? I'll say about 50% improvement so far. In the 2 years that I've had it, you see there the surgery went well. There's a picture of me learning how to use the device. The big nutshell there is at my worst, I've had about 9 seizures a month that many of you out there, I'm sure, were worse off. Maybe some were better, but the point is it doesn't matter how bad your epilepsy is. Any seizures stinks. None of us like them, and this device applies to all of us. So get it if you want to get rid of epilepsy, because it certainly made my life better. And it's easy to use. The best thing that I like about it is that it has made me a partner with my care team. Dr. Cash is ready for me when I walk in the door, and I feel like I'm a part of the team. I have my notes in hand. He has his notes in hand. Wendy, who is my therapy consultant on the NeuroPace team, she's ready. Tara Jennings, who's the nurse practitioner, she's ready. The last meeting we had, she said, so how's it going? And I said, well, you should know. And she said, well, we still need to hear from you. And we kind of started from there. So it's a good, it's a collaborative time. And, it's a journey. It's been 2 years so far after the operation, and we've made a lot of progress. And I enjoy it. I wish it was going faster. But the point is, it's big steps from where I was before, and we're still continuing to move forward. I put the picture there of the trip with my family because the point is it's a journey with the family, and because we're out traveling. And for many people, traveling is an improvement. There's little lifestyle improvements all along. So anyway, I'll open that up to questions for Dr. Cash and for me. Go right ahead.
Okay, as a reminder, there's a little icon where you can raise your hand and I will unmute you if you have a question for Dr. Cash or for Wida. Does anyone have a question? Or if you're shy about talking, Stacy Kinley has a question. I will unmute you. Stacy, you are now live. Go ahead. Stacy, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, and we can hear you. Go ahead and address your question, please.
I'm just curious why this is more for adults. I have an infant daughter who has uncontrolled focal seizures. And will it ever be available for children?
Dr. Cash, did you hear that? She's asking on behalf of her daughter.
Yeah, I heard. I just wasn't sure when I was supposed to talk back.
Okay.
That's a great question, and it's something we have talked about quite a lot in our group. The official answer is that from an FDA point of view, it is not available for kids, but like many things, it could be used off-label for kids. Our concern, and we've actually thought about it quite a bit. The problem is with kids, depending on how old they are, the skull is still forming. And putting a titanium can in the skull at that point might lead all sorts of tricky developments over time. So there's sort of that physical problem that one needs to overcome. That being said, I think that there are absolutely indications where we would recommend it for patients, and actually we have done so in one or two. They haven't gone forward with it yet, but they're still thinking about it. Certainly an older kid, a teenager, we'd absolutely be thinking about it, and I think it's something that should be thought of for all sorts of kids. I hope that answers it. It's not the most complete answer. I don't have a timeline as to when anybody will absolutely improve it, but it is certainly something that many of us are thinking about and willing to do under certain circumstances.
Thanks. Sorry.
Okay, we now have a question from Carlton Zignis. Stacy, I'm going to mute you again.
Yeah, please.
And let's go make Carlton live. Carlton, you should now be live. You may ask your question. Carlton, can you hear us? We are unable to hear you. Carlton, I'm sorry, we are unable to hear you. I did submit the questions that you sent in earlier. Was it one of those questions? If you can, type it in the chat window. Carlton, I'm sorry, we cannot hear you. Okay, I have a question from Theodora. Let me unmute Theodora. Theodora, go ahead, you're live. Hello, Theodora?
Hi.
Okay, I heard something.
I wasn't sure if you were able to hear me.
Go ahead,
I
Theodora.
was diagnosed with epilepsy back in 2014. I unfortunately was induced into a coma from some unknown virus, and it left me with epilepsy, and I'm on multiple medications, and I will actually be seeing, as I unfortunately already forgot your name, doctor, in a week or so. But is it still possible for women to have children after this type of surgery?
Sorry to hear that story, although it's not a typical story, but always distressing to hear it. I think if I heard your question properly, you were asking about children after the surgery. Is that what I heard?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing about the device or using the device or practicing with the device that would preclude building a family. That's not really a concern, frankly. There's all reason to think that, you know, it shouldn't really interfere with anything like that.
Okay. 'Cause as of right now, with all the multiple medications I'm on, that's one of the big factors. My husband
That is,
and
yeah, and that's really a subject for another at least hour-long webinar. You know, the importance or you know what to think about when you're for family planning while on seizure medications. It is a big deal and a very real concern for families, both in terms of having children and breastfeeding and everything. You know, one of our messages to our patients is that it doesn't, you know, preclude building a family, having seizures and being on medications, but it is absolutely something that we want to, as physicians, help make as safe and as successful as possible and help you work through. But it's a real big concern and obviously beyond the scope of what we're talking about now, but we understand that that's really a big deal.
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to mute you, Theodora. Carlton, I'm going to unmute you and give you another try if you want to. Maybe if your microphone's not working, you might want to try calling in on the number and see if that helps. But you are live.
Hearing me?
Yes, Carlton, we can hear you. Yay.
Just a quick question. What level of seizure activity makes it worthwhile?
Okay, I'll take this one, Dr. Cash.
Great, thank you.
Carlton, at any level, I would say, if your medicine isn't working, try this. You know, I tried 10 different medications. I even tried smuggling one in from Canada, quite frankly, and it didn't work. So my feeling is anything that impacts your lifestyle is something that impacts your lifestyle. And so I was waiting and waiting for this device to be approved by the FDA, and as soon as it was, I signed up to get the device. The only thing that stopped me from getting it sooner is that I had to move from New York to Boston. And fortunately, my one neurologist had been a resident with my new neurologist, and that certainly helped smooth things over and made it a lot of fun to move from NYU to Mass General. So I encourage you to investigate it by all means. It's been terrific. And, you know, as a patient ambassador, I had the opportunity to meet many others, about 25 others out in California, and several of them were even in the trials and have had the device for close to 10 years now. And to speak to them and learn about their experience with it for so long, you know, the data that you saw in this presentation is for the 4 years, but to speak to some of these people that have had it for even longer is really compelling and encouraging. And so really, you know, when we talk about it being a journey, I can only share with you the 2 years that I've had with Dr. Cash and the amazing team with whom I work. But it's making really successful, you know, impact out there. So, you know, I encourage you to look into it.
This has been really great. I really learned a lot here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carlton. Did you have any further questions?
Oh, yeah. Are those spikes, the leads, are they actually into the brain tissue?
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends on the kind of seizures and where they're coming from. Some of the electrodes can sit on top of the brain's surface, but other ones we do put them right into the brain, which I realize sounds sort of crazy, but actually you can get away with slipping these kinds of flexible electrode leads through the brain to a part of the brain that's deep, for the hippocampus and sort of in the middle of the brain. You can't get there any other way except by going through other parts of the brain. But you could do that. These things are thin and they're flexible, and remarkably the brain can sustain them without any evidence of problems. So yeah, we do put them into the brain, and that's the only way to get to those areas.
Okay, thank you. And how long does a test like that take?
How long does the, excuse me, yeah, I think this was a question that somebody had asked before. How long does it take us to do the investigation beforehand, I think is what you're asking.
Yes.
Generally, was that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Generally, patients are, excuse me, are in the hospital for 7 days, sometimes 2 weeks. Again, it depends a lot on how frequent their seizures are. So if someone is having seizures every day, we probably only need to have them in for a few days to collect the data we need. If somebody has a seizure once a week, it might take us a little longer to get the information. It is, you know, it's not a trivial process. It's a surgery. It's sitting in the hospital for a while waiting to have seizures, but it's the only way to get that kind of information currently. And usually most patients, they get bored and they get a little stir crazy, but they tolerate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Carlton. Does anyone else? I don't see any other hands raised. Are there any other questions for either Wida or Dr. Cash? Jeff. All right. I am going to unmute Jeff. Jeff, you are now live.
Hi, yeah. So I'm curious, you said that you could implant up to 4 leads, but you can only stimulate 2. So I was just curious what the use cases are for the other 2 unused leads if you go back in and use them at some time later on or something like that.
Yeah, good question, and way to pay attention to the details. I'm impressed. The idea is that sometimes we have a pretty good idea of where the seizures are coming from, but there are 2 situations at least, one of which is we say, boy, they're coming from more than 2 areas. Let's say they're coming from 3 areas. And so but we think 2 of the areas are most important, and maybe the third one's not so important. Or we say the areas they're coming from are fairly big. Let's try and get a little bit more coverage. And we don't want to subject the patient to more surgeries than they need, because each surgery is a risk in and of itself, right? And a time out and, from life and all that. So let's go ahead and put enough electrodes in that we think we cover it, and the FDA allows us to put into up to 4 leads. And then let's connect the 2 that we think are going to be the greatest bang for the buck. But then over time, we might see, you know what, we're not quite getting the results that we want. And we have more data now that maybe is giving us a slightly different picture. So when it comes time to swap out the device for a new one because of battery, or even just because we think clinically it's important, it's then very easy and a very small surgery to basically make a skin incision, reconnect the leads we want, and then close it back up again. That's the kind of thing we could do as sort of an outpatient procedure, frankly, you know, an in and out in one day, and without having to do a big surgery. So that's the rationale behind it. You know, obviously, I would much rather have a device that allows me to put in, you know, a lot of leads and connect all of the leads. But just technologically speaking, what NeuroPace has already created is quite impressive. But we're not quite at that stage where we could do, you know, lots of electrodes in lots of places. But we're heading there. So for now, this is sort of the next best approach that we could get to. Does that make some sense?
Gotcha. Yep, it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, let me scroll down, see who else has their hand raised. I do not see any more questions. Okay. Any final words then, Dr. Cash or Wida?
I mean, these have been great questions. People are asking the right kinds of things. I think that I would just sort of underline what Wida said. You know, who is an RNS for? Who does it really benefit? Is it for you? Always hard to determine, but there's no harm in talking about it with your neurologist and just thinking about it, just starting out the thinking process to see, is this a direction to go? You know, that's always worth doing.
It definitely is, and I just found a hand raised. Michael, you are now live. Go ahead. Michael, I see your hand raised, but I cannot hear you yet. Michael, do you want to try and type it in the chat window and I'll read it? The chat window is down below, 3 lines under the box that lists all our names, the attendees' names. Okay, Michael, I'm sorry, we're unable to hear anything. Okay. Still nothing. Michael, I'm sorry, even though you're unmuted, I am not hearing you. I'm not hearing anything. Okay, I have been recording this webinar, and hopefully if all goes well, technology and I have rather a mixed relationship. I will save it and try and get it loaded up on our website. I have to get someone to do that for me because I'm unsure how to do that. Dr. Cash and Wida have agreed that I can share these slides, so they will be emailing those to me. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to thank Dr. Cash and Wida for joining us and sharing this wonderful information. It gives us hope. We at the Epilepsy Foundation always want to explore as many choices as possible. Epilepsy is not a one-size-fits-all condition, and the treatment and eventually the cure is probably going to be multifaceted as well. So Dr. Cash, thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan and the EFA, for setting this up. I think it's great that you do these things.
And thanks, Mike from NeuroPace as well.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Dr. Cash, and thank you so much, Rita.
All right. Well, if we don't, I'm scrolling up and down, and I'm not seeing any more hands. Oh, I saw another hand from Carlton. I think. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
All right. Let's unmute. Okay, Carlton, you are live.
Okay, you mentioned in the beginning that the NeuroPace looks for brain patterns. And I was wondering, is it looking to record the normal brain patterns and then detects the unusual one, or is it just looking for a seizure type brain pattern?
It is looking constantly, so it's always amplifying the EEG and feeding it into the little computer that's in there. What it is looking for is a particular pattern associated with seizure, because that's the only thing we want to stimulate. We don't want to stimulate normal activity. But you can't do one without the other, so we have to be able to distinguish seizure from background, from normal, and you know, we do that by looking at examples of the data as it comes in. And then once we've got the detector set up, it's only looking for the abnormal.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Beautiful. All right. Well, for those of you who are sports fans, Wita reminded me that there's a game at 8 o'clock tonight. So for those of you who want to watch the game, we're ending on time. So I'm happy to release you to watch the game if that is your gig.
Thanks, everybody, for your interest. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for your time, Dr. Cash and Wita and Mike. And thank you, everyone who joined us. We hope to provide more and more of these informational webinars. And this was a perfect lead-in. November is Epilepsy Awareness Month. So I think this was a nice way to learn about something new and exciting on the forefront of technology and changing how we treat seizures. So thank you all, and good night and good health to you all.
Thank you, Susan.
All
Thank
right.
you, Susan.
Goodbye, everyone. I'm going to stop recording now.